The Nuance of Sleep in 1v1 by Elo Bandit. So what is sleep? Well, sleep is a status mechanic. After being hit with a sleep-inducing move, immobilizes a Pokemon for X turns, where X is a randomly chosen number between 1 and 3. You have a 1/3 chance of waking up on turn 1, a 1/3 chance of waking up on turn 2, and a 1/3 chance of waking up on turn 3. A Pokemon will not wake up the turn that it is put to sleep. So why do people want to ban sleep? Well, there's a few reasons. It removes choices from the play space, it turns skill-based gameplay into luck-based gameplay, and the counterplay in terms of counter building and counter picking in Team Preview is very limited. A couple of points for sleep. It's not conventionally overpowered, with the possible exception of Snorlax. It doesn't have very high usage. Putting an opponent to sleep is no worse than KOing them in terms of how many choices they have. And it brings viability to otherwise bad Pokemon like Mega Camerupt, Relicanth, and Jumpluff. What actually uses sleep in 1v1? Yawn and Protect is one of the most common and one of the most effective sleep strategies in 1 vs 1. It's used by a lot of Pokemon because it's undeniably powerful in any situation. On turn 1 of a battle, these Pokemon will use Yawn to make their opponent drowsy, and on turn 2, they will Protect to avoid any damage. This will put their opponent to sleep and give them free reign to either attack them with their choice of stab moves, coverage, or boosts. There are 3 Pokemon that use Spore in 1 vs 1. Smeargle, who uses Spore, Imprison, and Transform to become your opponent and force them to struggle at you. Breloom, who puts your opponent to sleep and sets up a substitute and either a Leech Seed or Focus Punch. And Amoonguss, who is able to put his opponent to sleep before beating them with Giga Drain and Foul Play. We also have a few Sleep Powder users in 1v1. The most notable being Jumpluff, who puts his opponent to sleep and uses Sub Protect in combination with Leech Seed to slowly stall out an opponent. Viability has an accuracy enhancing ability that allows it to land Sleep Powder more often and lets it use a Quiver Dance Hurricane set to great effectiveness. Mega Venusaur has Sleep Powder as an option, and it can help its matchups versus things that would otherwise knock it out. Even Tangle uses it to turn a couple of odd matchups in its favor. Lovely Kiss is only really used by Jinx, although I'm also putting Smeargle here because Smeargle can use it to help beat grass types that Spore does not affect. There are several notable Hypnosis users in 1v1, the first of which being Mega Gengar, who puts his opponent to sleep on turn 1 and then abuses the fact that they are asleep to land a double damage Hex or Sludge Bomb. Mega Gardevoir also has Hypnosis as an option, sometimes putting slower Pokemon like Mega Mawile to sleep and 2 or 3 hit KOing them afterwards. Alolan Ninetales can use Hypnosis alongside its Aurora Veil, and even some Pokemon like Yanma find viability using an accuracy boosted Hypnosis followed by Substitute and Defog, since Defog actually lowers the opponent's evasiveness, allowing you to hit more Hypnosises in succession. And lastly, Xurkitree is here as a Hypnosis user, since it can use Tail Glow afterwards to blow the opponent back after setting up. Nothing really uses Sing in 1v1, but for the purposes of this video, I'm including Wigglytuff, who can use a Wide Lens, Sing, Fire Blast, Blizzard, Dazzling Gleam set. And there's also a couple of Megas that can learn Sing, Mawile and Altaria. However, these Pokemon would really just rather be using other moves. The opportunity cost of using a 55% accurate Sing is too high. Grass Whistle is used by the likes of Mega Sceptile, who can outspeed pretty much everything and have a chance at putting it to sleep. Some Subseed Whimsicott and Cottony also use Grass Whistle to sometimes win matchups that they would otherwise lose. And lastly, I'm also including Dark Void in this. Even though Darkrai isn't technically in the tier, Smeargle can still learn the move, so I'm including it for the purposes of completion. So what counters sleep in 1v1? Sleep users are countered by Taunt, Substitute, specific abilities in Magic Bounce, Insomnia, and Vital Spirit, grass types, Lum Berry, and getting KO'd. So let's talk about Taunt, because it's not quite as clear-cut of a counter as it might seem. It does beat Pokemon like Jumpluff that lose as soon as the Taunt user wakes up. However, faster sleep users like Mega Gengar can actually outspeed the Taunt, put you to sleep anyway, and then 2-hit KO you despite you having the counter move. You also have to watch out for things like Z Yawn and Z Belly Drum from Pokemon like Snorlax, who can actually put you to sleep even through a Taunt. Alright, so let's talk about Substitute, because there are a lot of cases where Substitute turns out to not actually win you the match versus sleep users. Like in the case of Jumpluff, who wins thanks to its ability Infiltrator. There are also Pokemon, once again, that outspeed, like Mega Gengar. You have to actually outspeed Pokemon with your Substitute for Substitute to counter the sleep move. And even in that case, when you outspeed, like versus Snorlax, the sleep user, if it knows that you're substituting, it can attack your substitutes over and over. However, if you're expecting them to use a sleep move, Substitute will win you the match, provided that you're faster. Alright, and then let's talk about abilities, because people always bring up, oh, just use a sleep counter ability, such as Insomnia, Vital Spirit, or Magic Bounce. However, the problem with this is most of these Pokemon aren't really viable. Of these that are technically possible, the only ones that are actually viable or on the viability rankings are Mega Sableye, and then I guess you can also include Mega Banette and Mega Diancie are also pretty good. However, the majority of these are either not viable or just not that great. And then let's also talk really quickly about grass types, because they're always noted as a sleep counter. However, 4 out of 8 of the top-rated grass Pokemon use some form of sleep themselves, and these Pokemon, they do counter Spore, Sleep Powder, and Grass Whistle. They're just straight up immune to those moves. However, they can still lose to Yawn, Lovely Kiss, Hypnosis, and Sing. They're not immune to those moves. And then the other thing that people always bring up in regards to sleep or to status in 1 vs. 1 is, of course, Lum Berry. However, nothing really uses Lum Berry by default in 1v1, and there's a really good reason for that. And that's that anything that can viably run Lum Berry would really rather be using either a Z move or a choice item, because these are either setup physical attackers or sturdy physical attackers that can abuse this type of thing. However, the opportunity cost of not using that more powerful offensive item is too high to actually justify using a Lum Berry in most cases. Okay, so let's talk about getting KOs, because to get a KO on a sleep user, you have to do 2 things. You have to outspeed the sleeper, and you have to knock out the sleeper. And that's way easier said than done, because, well, some of these sleepers are really, really fast. We've got Mega Sceptile at base 145, which is really, really fast. Mega Gengar at base 130, which is still very, very, very fast, but a little bit closer. And then we've got Jumpluff at 110, which is a little bit more reasonable, and Gardevoir at 100, and below there it starts being so much of a problem. But it is a concern that you actually have to outspeed the sleeper in order to hit them, in order to taunt them, in order to substitute. Outspeeding is always very, very important, especially when we're talking about sleep. And so the second thing you have to do is you have to knock out the sleeper, which is really, really tough to do in a lot of cases, especially when a lot of these sleep users are really bulky Pokemon. We've got Snorlax and Mega Blastoise and Mega Swampert. These guys are ridiculously bulky and very, very hard to break through unless you have a super effective stab or Z move that's going to melt them in one hit. So what's the point of breaking down these sleep counters? Well, it tells us that each sleep Pokemon has its own unique counters, and you can't just slap Taunt or Substitute on your team and claim that you no longer have to worry about sleep as a status or as a strategy. Because each Pokemon individually has plenty of checks and counters, but trying to beat all of the sleep users at once is comparable to trying to beat all water types at once. It's just not going to happen. You're going to run into problems. Alright, so now let's talk about really what I consider to be the crux of the issue, which is overpowered versus uncompetitive. What do people mean when they say broken? Do they mean that something is overpowered, meaning that it is consistently defeating too wide a range of opponents? Or do they mean that it is uncompetitive, meaning that it removes or invalidates player choices in favor of random chance? There is a link between uncompetitive and Hax Dependant. A Pokemon is considered uncompetitive if it shifts the game far enough away from skill by forcing hacks and random number generation to take precedence over players' choices in the majority of cases. If we're talking about what's overpowered, the only real contender is Snorlax, since it's the only Pokemon that has so far managed to break into the A rankings of the Viability rankings. However, it's worth noting a couple of Pokemon on the uncompetitive side of things, since some of these Pokemon may or may not abuse random number generation and hacks too much to get their wins. So let's take a look at that. So is a Pokemon like Smeargle Hax Dependent enough to be considered uncompetitive? Well, if we define a win condition as getting your Imprison and your Transform off, and if we define loss condition as getting hit with a single attack, you're actually going to end up winning the match 2/3 of the time. The only time that you lose is the 1/3 first turn wake chance. Alright, so let's take a look at Jumpluff. Is Jumpluff Hax Dependent? Well, if we define a win condition as successfully setting up the Subseed healing loop from behind a substitute, and we define a loss condition as getting hit with a single attack, the odds that you'll lose can be calculated pretty easy. It's basically the odds that you'll miss Sleep Powder on turn 1, plus the odds that your opponent will first turn wake and you'll miss Sleep Powder on a later turn. And those odds go down the farther you go because it gets less and less likely that your opponent is going to continue waking up on the very first turn. So, we're able to calculate that your total odds of dying are roughly 24.81%, meaning your total odds of winning a match are 75.19%. And then in the same vein, let's take a peek at Mega Gengar, and we define a win condition as landing 2 hits, so basically any sort of type of thing where it's like, oh, you're a Mega Gengar versus a sturdy Pokemon, you really just need to land 1 extra hit because you're going to 2-hit KO them, they're going to 1-hit KO you, you only need the 1 extra turn of sleep. So basically, you have your 40% odds of dying on turn 1 for missing Hypnosis, and then there's a 20% added on to that because there's also the first turn wake chance. So it comes out to a total of you're winning 40% of the time provided you're not running Substitute. If you are running Substitute, you'll win 47% of the time, but neither of those are actually majority wins. Alright, so now we take a look at Whimsicott. So is Whimsicott Hax Dependent? And probably, because we just looked at Gengar. So Whimsicott, we define the win condition, of course, same as Jumpluff, is starting the Subseed healing loop safely. And we define the loss condition as getting hit with a single attack. We just assume that Whimsicott is using the sleep move, substitute, sleep move, substitute, sleep move, substitute combo over and over until the win condition can be hit or the loss condition is hit. So you've got 45% chance of dying on turn 1 just from the Grass Whistle miss, and you've got a 10% chance of dying on turn 3 based on the first turn wake and the Grass Whistle miss, and calculate it all down to you have a 39.92% chance of actually coming out on top and winning against something that would otherwise OHKO you. So now I think it's kind of important to take a look at what isn't Hax Dependent, because that does actually exist. If we take a peek at Breloom with this very specific set that's off to the right there, the Toxic Orb set, if we define win condition as setting up that same exact Subseed healing loop, the one that Jumpluff and Whimsicott use, and we define loss condition as, once again, getting hit with a single attack, assuming that you're faster, you actually win this 100% of the time. There is no luck involved whatsoever, because your Spore accuracy is perfect, and you're not going to be hit through Protect, so you never run out of substitutes either because of Toxic Orb and Poison Heal. So you can essentially get all your health back with Substitute and Protect, and just land Spores until they don't first turn wake. Then you can get your Leech Seed off safely, and you'll win the match. Alright, so now let's talk about Yawn, because Yawn is a little bit different than all of the other forms of sleep, in that it has more than one win condition. It has a soft win condition and a hard win con. So the soft win condition I'm going to define as landing 2 attacks or 1 boosted attack, and I'm going to define the hard win condition as landing 3 attacks or landing 2 boosted attacks. The loss condition will be taking 2 hits, since we are assuming that any Yawn Protect user is bulky enough to survive 1 hit on its own. So, your odds of dying on turn 1 and 2 are 0% thanks to your bulk and Protect. your odds of dying on turn 4, which is the first turn wake, are 1/3. So for most uses of Yawn, you are going to be playing with a 2/3 win chance, which is pretty good. This would be anything in the likes of Swampert using Yawn, Protect, and Waterfall against a counter Donphan who will counter and beat the Swampert if it wakes up, but the 2/3 of the time it's going to stay asleep and lose the match. That actually makes sense as a win condition for Swampert. However, the hard win condition, which I think the good example here is Snorlax versus a Steel type, if your opponent remains asleep for 2 turns, which is a 1/3 chance that this will happen, and they can be hit with like a belly drum followed by 2 double edges, will actually get through like a resisted matchup. This gets us into the gray area of, is this still actually a competitive strategy? Like 66%, sure. 33% to overthrow something that really should be beating you, maybe not. Now we take a little bit of a different perspective and we look at these guys based on how likely they are to actually win the match, not just hit their sleep move. And we see that there's kind of a little significant cutoff at the 2/3 mark, where everything at 2/3 or above is pretty much dedicated to using its sleep strategy, and without its sleep strategy, that Pokemon pretty much falls apart. Everything below 50%, the sleep move is pretty much thrown on as an other option or a cheese move that isn't necessary to the Pokemon's kit, and it's usually used to grab a couple of wins that would have otherwise been losses, rather than to ensure wins against the right matchup. And this also ties into relative viability. So if we take a look at where these Pokemon are right now, according to the current viability rankings, I've organized them here by what type of sleep they use, and we can see that we've got stuff like Snorlax and Mega Venusaur at the top in the A rankings, and some of the lower ranks at the bottom. And we take a look at what would happen if sleep were to be banned for each of these, and we see the changes that would happen. This is obviously speculated by me, but I think it does a pretty good job to illustrate the differences as like Jumpluff gets hit really, really hard, whereas Mega Venusaur doesn't get hit at all, because it can simply run Leech Seed or Charm or Giga Drain or Sludge Bomb or anything else and be totally fine, whereas Jumpluff is totally decimated and really is out of options except for like Strength Sap. So like Yawn users, for instance, for the most part all take a little hit in viability, with the exception of Blastoise, who still has plenty of options in offensive Fake Out Hydro Cannon or defensive Counter Coat. Other Pokemon that we see drop a bit are a couple of Hypnosis users, though notably not Mega Gardevoir, as Gardevoir can simply run something like Will-O-Wisp, Calm Mind, and retain its viability. And also notably, not a single Sing or Grass Whistle user loses viability, because all of those Pokemon would rather just be using an alternate coverage move, or something like Taunt, or Grass Whistle, or Encore, something like that. I said Grass Whistle, I realize, but I'm sure you guys get the point that I'm trying to make. These Pokemon are capable of just running other moves instead of the sleep move, and actually banning that sleep move wouldn't really hurt them very much. Possible courses of action. Option number 1. We as a community could simply decide not to ban sleep, with the reasoning that every sleep user has sufficient counters, even if those counters aren't necessarily shared by all other sleep users. Just because random number generation is added into the game doesn't mean that an entire playstyle or mechanic is invalid, especially when so many Pokemon depend on that mechanic for viability. Sleep is not overpowered with only one notable A-ranked Pokemon, nor is it uncompetitive if you simply treat Put to Sleep as a win condition. Option number 2 would be to ban all sleep, under the premise that Pokemon should be a game of prediction and skill. Forcing another person to deal with luck in the form of sleep turns is inherently uncompetitive no matter what form the sleep comes in. Option 3 would be to ban Snorlax, with the reasoning that Snorlax is the only Pokemon that actually abuses sleep to the point where it breaks into the top of the viability rankings, and without Snorlax, sleep wouldn't really be a threat or an issue at all. Option 4 would be to ban only Hypnosis, Sing, Grass Whistle, and Dark Void, with the reasoning that only the moves which don't reasonably guarantee the win condition of sleep should be considered uncompetitive. taking a 40% shot at the dark of a losing matchup like Whimsicott versus Charizard and coming out on top because of one lucky turn is completely different than picking the right Pokemon and winning with a dedicated sleep strategy, like in the case of Jumpluff versus Golem. Why I like option 4 the best? I think that option 4 follows the most consistent line of reasoning, because Pokemon that rely on low hack sleep to function against other Pokemon are perfectly healthy since they're completely matchup based and can be built around. Meanwhile, Pokemon that rely on Hax Dependent sleep are unhealthy since they turn the game into luck without any windows of counterplay. And this change would make the smallest difference to the viability of most Pokemon, since everything using inaccurate sleep is just as good, if not better, if using another move instead. Meanwhile, the Pokemon using accurate sleep aren't deprived of their viability. Additionally, the solution helps standardize counters a little bit better, as you can simply include a Taunt over base 110 speed to beat non-attacking sleep users. That pretty much sums up my thoughts on sleep in 1v1. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'd love to hear your guys' input in the comments section below. See you next time!